The scrubs hung loose on her frame, and Laura Bennett adjusted them for the third time that morning, the fabric sliding against her ribs as she moved through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU corridor in Denver. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like 1,000 cicadas trapped in glass, and she breathed through her mouth to avoid the antiseptic that had colonized every surface, every crevice, every molecule of air in this place. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting full lines, noting vitals in charts with handwriting so small it barely registered on the page. Invisible. That was the job now. That was the survival strategy. Major Graves sat in the waiting area outside his son's room, his broad shoulders curved forward in a posture that broke something in her chest. The Major's left forearm was visible beneath rolled sleeves, and there it was, a tattoo in faded blue ink, dated the 14th of September, 2019. Valkyrie, the 22nd of June, 2012 through the 14th of September, 2019. She didn't recognize her. The IED in the Joland district had erased for years from his memory, along with function in his left leg and partial use of his right arm. He stared at his son through the observation window, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. Laura turned away before he could register her presence. Tyler Graves was 10 years old, and 6 months ago a minivan had T-boned his father's sedan at the intersection of Hamden and Colorado Boulevard. The car had flipped twice. The doctors said Tyler's spine had shattered at the L3 alpha vertebrae, the damage irreversible, a complete transaction of the spinal cord that left him paralyzed from the waist down. 12 specialists had reviewed his imaging. 12 had written it in their official assessments: prognosis poor, recovery trajectory minimal, recommend comfort care discussions. The boy couldn't move his legs. The boy couldn't feel anything below his navel. The boy spent his days in a wheelchair, staring at television programs he didn't process, his dark eyes carrying the specific exhaustion that only children in chronic pain understood. Laura read his chart for the third time that shift, her eyes tracking the notations like a combat drone reading terrain. Spinal cord injury, complete transection, T12 or L1 level, ASHA grade A pain management, gabapentin 300 mg 3 times daily, tramadol as needed. Physical therapy, passive range of motion only, no functional recovery expected. The handwriting belonged to Dr. Maxwell, the spine specialist, and his notes were precise and clinical and utterly certain in their finality. She turned the page. And there it was, Dr. Pierce's entry from 2 days prior, red flagged for review, patient's assigned nurse has initiated an authorized physical therapy protocol. Recommend documentation and monitoring. Possible liability issue if unqualified personnel attempt evidence-based care without physician oversight. Unqualified. The word sat in her throat like something sharp. She had performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife in a house in Bagram where the rotor wash from the Black Hawk shook the walls and blood made the floor slick enough that her boots slipped. She had held a soldier's heart in her hands, actually in her hands, fingers wrapped around the organ itself, and kept it beating for the 23 minutes it took the surgical team to stabilize him enough for transport. That soldier, Private Kevin Mercer, had lived. He had completed 2 more tours. He had married a girl named Sarah in a church in North Carolina, and Laura had received an invitation she never attended, a life she couldn't witness because she didn't officially exist. But Pierce didn't know that. Pierce saw a nurse whose credentials were spotty, whose work history was vague, whose references checked out to phone numbers that disconnected years ago. The ICU doors slid open, and Dr. Pierce entered with the presence of a man who believed his cologne was an instrument of medicine. 3 residents trailed behind him like satellites in orbit around a planet made of ego, and Laura felt her spine straighten in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with recognition. She knew his type. She had survived men like this, men whose competence was real but whose arrogance had made them sloppy, men who saw women as problems to solve rather than people to respect. He was tall, mid-50s, with the kind of jawline that had probably opened doors his entire life, and he dressed like someone who believed tailored suits could substitute for actual intelligence. "Good morning, Laura," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that made every word sound like a reprimand. "How is our hopeless case this morning?" "Tyler's pain levels are stable," she replied, her voice quiet, professional, deferential. "Vitals within normal range." He's resting. Pierce glanced at the monitors without actually looking at them, a gesture she had seen 1,000 times in 100 hospitals. And his bowel function? His catheter output? Within expectations for his injury level? Have you been counseling the father about realistic timelines? About the severity of his son's prognosis? Pierce moved closer to Tyler's room, his residents clustering like chicks. These families sometimes develop magical thinking. They need a firm hand. A voice of reason. I trust you understand the difference between compassion and delusion. She didn't respond. Silence was armor. One of the residents, a young man with the pink scrubs and confused expression of someone 6 weeks into his rotation, glanced at her with something like sympathy. Pierce noticed, and his attention sharpened like a blade turning edge forward. Tell me, gentlemen, what is the standard of care for complete spinal cord transection at this level? Comfort measures, the resident said quietly. Pain management. Psychological support for the family unit. Correct. And has anyone here noted anything unusual in this patient's chart? He waited, and the air in the corridor changed, became thinner, harder to breathe. Passive range of motion exercises are standard. Beneficial for preventing contractures, maintaining circulation. But what happens when a nurse decides to expand beyond passive protocols? When she initiates active assistance exercises without physician authorization? What happens? Liability, one of the residents offered. Liability, Pierce repeated, nodding. And something worse. False hope. The cruelest thing we can give a desperate family is the belief that their child will walk again when the science is clear. When the imaging is definitive. When 12 specialists have already rendered their professional judgment. He glanced at Laura without quite making eye contact. Some people prioritize how they feel over what the evidence tells us. And that's how patients get hurt. He swept past her then, his white coat trailing like a cape, and the residents followed in his wake. Laura stood alone in the corridor, her hand steady at her sides, her face composed into the expression of someone who had heard nothing that concerned her. But her fingers had curled slightly, the way they did when she was remembering the weight of a soldier's heart, the texture of spinal tissue, the specific knowledge that came only from holding human beings together when the rules said they should fall apart. She waited until Pierce and his orbit had completed their rounds and disappeared into the elevator. Then she moved into Tyler's room, where the boy lay staring at the ceiling tile, his small frame barely raising the blanket above him. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, normal, stable, ongoing. She checked his foresight, his catheter connections, his pressure points where the wheelchair made contact with his body, careful and thorough, every movement documented in her mind the way field medics document trauma, location, severity, intervention. "Hi, Tyler," she said quietly. "I'm going to work on your legs for a little bit. That okay?" The boy's eye shifted toward her, a minimal movement. "Will it help?" The question hung in the air like something dangerous. The answer she was supposed to give, the Pierce answer, was no. It won't help. It won't change anything. Your spine is severed, and severed means permanent, means never, means accept it. But Laura had held lives together through worse odds than this. She had kept breathing soldiers who shouldn't have been breathing, had restored function to bodies everyone else had written off. Pain was information. Scars told stories. And this child's nervous system was not yet ready to surrender. "I think it might," she said, and she meant it. She began the exercises she wasn't supposed to do, the active assistance movements, the precise manipulation of his knee joints, the careful extension and flexion that kept the neural pathways activated, kept the possibility alive. Her hands moved with muscle memory from another life, another uniform, another universe where she had been someone's lifeline. She didn't explain the science. She didn't argue with Pierce's assessment. She simply worked, her fingers moving along Tyler's legs with the tenderness of someone who understood that the body was listening, that somewhere deep in his damaged nervous system, signals were still looking for pathways home. Major Graves appeared in the doorway at some point. He watched her work, his one functional hand gripping the doorframe. She didn't look at him. But she felt his attention the way you feel weight shifting in water, a change in pressure, a displacement, something fundamental reorganizing itself. She finished the exercises, smoothed the blanket back into place, and when she turned around, he was still there. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm a nurse," she replied, and kept her voice level, kept her eyes forward, kept the invisible woman invisible. But her heartbeat had changed rhythm, and she couldn't slow it down. Cedar Creek Medical stretched across 6 floors of Denver's North Capitol Hill, all glass and steel and the particular silence that only hospitals could manufacture. Laura Bennett adjusted her scrubs at the nurse's station, her movements economical, her presence nearly invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. The fluorescent lights cast everything in shades of institutional white as she reviewed Tyler Graves's chart one more time, her scarred hand steady despite the knot forming behind her ribs. Dr. Pierce materialized at 7:45 that morning with 12 specialists in his wake. Grand rounds. The weekly performance where hierarchy was reinforced through carefully calibrated humiliation. The group formed a semicircle around the nurse's station, and Laura recognized the setup immediately. She'd seen it before in different uniforms, different countries, different wars. This was the moment when someone needed to be made smaller so that someone else could appear larger. Pierce flipped through Tyler Graves's chart with theatrical precision, his fingers trailing across the pages as if conducting an orchestra. His voice carried the particular cadence of a man accustomed to obedience. "This," he said, turning to face the assembled specialists, "is what happens when compassion replaces competence." His eyes moved across the room and landed on Laura with the accuracy of a sniper. Nurse Bennett here has convinced herself that miracles exist. That a child with a complete spinal transection at T6 can somehow recover function through, he paused, voice dripping with contempt, sensory integration exercises. One of the neurologists, a woman with silver hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from 30 years of telling families there was nothing more to do, shifted her weight. She didn't nod, but she didn't contradict him either. Unconventional positioning techniques, Pierce continued, flipping pages. Proprioceptive training. Range of motion exercises that serve no therapeutic purpose beyond making a grieving father feel like his child still has hope. He turned to face the group directly now. 12 of us have independently confirmed complete spinal transection. 12. Yet our well-intentioned nurse here believes her weekend workshops, I assume they were online, given her background, trump our collective medical education. The orthopedic surgeon chuckled. Someone scribbled notes. Pierce had orchestrated this perfectly. He'd positioned himself as the voice of reason while framing Laura's work as the delusion of an overqualified hospital aide playing dress-up in scrubs. Laura stood against the wall, her spine pressed against the cool laminate. Her breathing remained steady, mechanical. One measured breath expanding her ribcage. 2. She didn't look away. She didn't blush. She didn't retreat into the corner and make herself smaller. She simply absorbed each word the way a combat medic absorbed information during incoming fire, clinical, categorical, stored for later processing. "The boy's father," Pierce said, his voice taking on a note of sympathy that was somehow worse than the contempt, "Major Graves, a Special Forces officer, my sympathies, truly, what a tragedy, has placed his hope in unconventional treatments because he's desperate." That's understandable. But enabling that delusion through unauthorized protocols is professionally irresponsible and potentially harmful to the patient. The neurologist who hadn't nodded earlier cleared her throat. "What protocols, specifically?" "Anything she's implementing without physician oversight," Pierce said smoothly. "The therapy sessions. The positioning work. The encouragement of a false sense of progress. All unauthorized. All documented in my observations." He wasn't lying, technically. Laura had been doing exactly that. But the truth had spaces between it like bullet holes through a sandbag, and Pierce had learned to drive his arguments through those gaps with precision. The grand rounds moved on, 3 more patients, 2 more opportunities for Pierce to demonstrate his supreme competence and the limitations of everyone around him. Laura returned to the medication station and began preparing Tyler's morning antibiotic regimen. 40 milligrams of famotidine. 2.5 milligrams of methylprednisolone. The doses became a meditation, the rhythm of preparation the only language that made sense anymore. At 10:17, Pierce found her at the vending machine in the break room. He brought 2 residents with him. Junior doctors barely finished with their training, still soft enough to absorb whatever shape a senior physician wanted to pour them into. The vending machine hummed its electric song as she inserted a dollar bill, waiting for a packet of saltine crackers she didn't want but needed the excuse to stand here in this moment. "Tell me something," Pierce said, and his voice carried that rehearsed casualness that meant nothing was casual at all. "Your nursing degree, where exactly is it from?" Laura didn't turn around. The crackers tumbled down the chute with a sound like small bones falling. "Online program," he continued, stepping closer. "Community college? I'm trying to understand how you ended up at Cedar Creek with credentials that seem to raise more questions than they answer." One of the residents laughed, a nervous sound that scraped against the inside of her skull like metal on metal. "Because I've been looking into your background," Pierce pressed, his voice dropping into something that might have been genuine curiosity if it hadn't been wrapped around a blade. "Your references are fascinating, most of them don't answer. Your previous employers seem to have remarkably poor record keeping. It's almost like someone went through and sanitized your history." Laura bent down and retrieved the crackers. The bag crinkled in her hands. She turned to face him then, and something in her expression made the second resident take a half-step backward. "Tell me, Laura," Pierce said, pronouncing her first name the way someone might pronounce a diagnosis of something incurable, or should I say Nurse Google. "Where did you get your degree?" "Strip mall certification program?" "One of those credential mills you can complete between shifts at whatever urgent care clinic would take you." The residents laughed again, and this time Pierce joined them. It was the sound of a pack recognizing weakness and moving in. She felt it then, the single tear that escaped before she could stop it, born not from sadness but from the precise pressure of 18 years of carrying secrets that weighed more than her own body. The tear tracked down her cheekbone, and she felt its warmth the way she'd felt the spray of hydraulic fluid the night a Black Hawk went down near Jalabad, the way she'd felt blood on her hands in a field hospital in Bagram where she'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife because the surgical instruments were 3 hours away and the patient had perhaps 90 minutes. She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact. Her voice, when she spoke, dropped an octave. It was the voice she'd trained out of her civilian vocabulary, the one that came from the part of her that had stopped asking permission and started giving orders. "I've held more spines together than you've seen in textbooks." The statement hung in the break room air like shrapnel after detonation. The vending machine hummed. The fluorescent lights buzzed their industrial song. Pierce's smile froze, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for something to flicker across his face that might have been recognition or might have been the first instinct toward genuine fear. Then he recovered. He had to. "Is that right?" he said, and his voice carried the edge of someone who'd just been contradicted and couldn't allow it to stand. "Well, you can hold whatever you want in your imagination, but in my ICU, we follow evidence-based protocols. Not intuition. Not unconventional wisdom from someone whose credentials don't add up." He turned to leave, the residents following like remoras. But something in his shoulders told her he'd made a decision in that moment. The tear had registered as a crack in her composure, and cracks were vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities were opportunities. She'd handed him a weapon, and he would sharpen it. That afternoon, as Laura prepared Tyler's therapy session, Pierce appeared in the doorway with a security guard, a man whose name she'd learned was Thompson, whose daughter was in 2nd grade, whose lunch breaks he spent on his phone looking at houses he couldn't afford. "One more time," Pierce said, and his voice had taken on the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. "One more contradiction of my treatment plans. One more unauthorized procedure. One more therapy session conducted without my explicit written permission, and I'll have security escort you from this facility. Are we clear?" Laura continued guiding Tyler through a gentle abduction of his right leg, the boy's concentration absolute, his small face scrunched with effort as his muscles attempted to remember their original instructions. "Tyler," Pierce said, his voice shifting into something softer, designed for the audience in the wheelchair more than for the woman at his side. This might feel good, but it isn't helping. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is accept what can't be changed. Major Graves sat beside his son's wheelchair, his posture rigid enough to suggest a military bearing that hadn't quite been trained out of him by 3 years of watching his child remain motionless from the waist down. His jaw worked, muscles visible along the line of his temple. He started to speak, then stopped. He looked at Laura, then at his son, then at Pierce. "We're clear," Laura said quietly, without turning around. "I understand the rules." But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, Pierce sat in his corner office on the 4th floor, the one with the view of the city skyline and the particular silence that came with institutional power. 3 board members occupied the leather chairs across from his desk: Patricia Chen, who controlled hospital finances; Robert Halloway, who'd been donating to Cedar Creek's research fund for 15 years, and Dr. Margaret Calhoun, the chief of medicine whose signature was required for any personnel action above the level of shift suspension. Pierce slid a folder across the mahogany desk. "We have a liability," he said, and his voice carried the measured certainty of someone delivering devastating news that he'd personally verified. "In our ICU." Patricia Chen opened the folder. Laura Bennett's employment application. Medical license documentation. Reference contact information that Pierce had been accumulating for 6 weeks, ever since the moment Laura had put her hands on the Graves boy, and something in Major Graves's expression had shifted into territory that made Pierce's instincts sharpen. "Her credentials don't align," Pierce continued. "Her previous employers either don't answer or claim minimal record retention. Her nursing school transcripts reference an institution that confirms her attendance but lists her in some kind of special program that staff members are apparently barred from discussing." Robert Halloway frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we have someone working in our ICU whose background doesn't pass basic verification. If something happens to a patient, particularly the Graves child, who already presents with a prognosis his family refuses to accept, this hospital faces catastrophic liability exposure." Margaret Calhoun leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking beneath her weight. "What do you need?" "I need authorization for a full background investigation. And I need to restrict her access to the Graves case immediately." What they didn't know was that Pierce was already a step ahead. He'd made calls to the nursing agency that had placed Laura, to the state licensing board, to a private investigator named Morris who specialized in credential verification for hospitals facing litigation exposure. Morris had already been digging through the gaps in Laura's history like an archaeologist at a site where something significant had been deliberately buried. And he was beginning to find exactly what Pierce needed him to find. The monitor's alarm cut through the MRI suite like a knife through flesh. Laura was 3 floors down in the break room, vending machine humming its mechanical song, when the code blue came through the intercom. "Imaging Suite 2. That was Tyler's room. She didn't think. She ran. The stairwell doors exploded open under her palms. Her scrubs caught the fluorescent light as she took the steps 2 at a time, muscle memory overriding protocol. 12 years of field extraction training had taught her that hesitation was a luxury only people who weren't bleeding to death could afford. Her badge clattered against her ribs with each stride. She burst through the imaging suite doors to find chaos wearing a white coat. 12 doctors frozen in debate. A neurosurgeon arguing for immediate transport to OR. An anesthesiologist chasing numbers on a monitor that kept dropping like a stone down a well. And in the center of it all, Tyler Graves, 10 years old, his small body rigid on the scanning table, his lips turning the color of storm clouds. Pierce stood by the wall, arms crossed, his voice a command that nobody was following. "We need another scan before we move him. We don't know what we're dealing with." The attending neurosurgeon, a woman named Dr. Saraya whose hands had performed 300 spinal surgeries, shook her head. "His pressure's dropping too fast. If we don't decompress in the next 90 seconds. Laura moved past them like they were furniture. She was already calling for supplies, her voice dropping an octave, the deferential nurse vanishing as though she'd never existed. "Betadine. Scalpel. Chest tube kit. Now." Not a question. A command. Pierce stepped into her path. "You are not authorized to." She moved around him the way water moves around stone. Her shoulder made contact with his chest, gentle but immovable, and he fell back against the wall. Positioning board, elevate his hips 15 degrees. "I need manual BP every 30 seconds. The residents moved without question. Authority has nothing to do with hospital hierarchy. It lives in the voice of someone who's held intestines in their hands while helicopters screamed overhead. Tyler's oxygen saturation was 68% and falling. Blood pressure 71/42. His small chest rose and fell with the terrified gasps of a child who couldn't feel anything below his shoulders. Laura's hands were already steady, already moving. The muscle memory didn't ask permission. In a forward operating base outside Bagram, a Humvee rollover had left 3 soldiers with epidural hematomas compressing their spinal cords. The nearest neurosurgeon was 40 minutes away by Black Hawk. Laura had been the only person with a surgical kit and hands that didn't shake. She prepped the site with betadine, the antiseptic smell sharp as copper wire in the recycled air. Her fingers found the compression point through landmarks that the hospital's textbooks would never teach, the exact space between C4 and CR5 where swelling blood was squeezing the life out of neural tissue. The scalpel felt like home in her palm. She made the incision with a precision that made the anesthesiologist inhale sharply. Not a hesitation. Not a tremor. A line as clean as calligraphy. "Sinus rhythm," she said quietly, monitoring Tyler's heart rate as she worked. "Stay with me, kiddo." The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping as she accessed the epidural space. 14 milliliters of blood, dark and old, released from the pressure. 70 seconds elapsed from the moment she'd entered the room. Tyler's oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 72, 78, 84. His blood pressure stabilized at 89/54. Still low, still precarious, but alive. The child's color changed from storm cloud blue to pale, breathing deepening, his small hands unclenching against the table. Dr. Soraya stepped back. She just stepped back, her mouth open, watching Laura work with the focused precision of someone performing surgery in a sandstorm with mortar rounds echoing in the distance. The attending surgeon's whisper was barely audible over the monitors. "Jesus Christ, she's doing a blind decompression." Laura said nothing. Her hands were already moving to the next task, documenting the intervention with fingers that should have been shaking but weren't. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of carrying secrets that could end careers if anyone asked the right questions. It was the particular calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. Pierce stood in the corner, watching. His face had gone the color of old bone. His jaw clenched. He pulled out his phone and walked toward the door, his thumb already moving across the screen. The other doctors parted around him like he was contagious. Nobody wanted to be near the man who'd been wrong about a 10-year-old boy's prognosis, wrong about the invisible nurse who'd just saved his life, wrong about everything that mattered. Laura stayed with Tyler for another 20 minutes, monitoring his vitals, ensuring the decompression held, speaking in low steady tones that made the child's breathing slow and deepen. By the time neurosurgery arrived for transport to the OR, Tyler's oxygen saturation was stable at 94%, his heart rate regular, his small face peaceful as morphine worked its chemistry through his veins. The neurosurgeon who'd been arguing for immediate transport stared at Laura's hands as she handed over the chart. "Where in God's name did you learn to do that?" Laura met her eyes for exactly 1 second. Long enough to communicate everything. Long enough that the surgeon's expression shifted from gratitude to something deeper, recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. "Field medicine," Laura said quietly. "A long time ago." She turned to leave the imaging suite, and that's when she saw it. Major Graves standing in the doorway, having arrived just as they wheeled Tyler out. His face was the color of cement. His hand pressed against his chest, right over his tattoo, the one with her call sign, Valkyrie, permanently etched into his skin from a night 19 years ago when she dragged him from a burning Humvee with 3 rounds still coming down range. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The recognition was there but incomplete, like looking at someone through frosted glass. But his hand came up. A salute. Precise. Respectful. Military to military. Laura nodded once and walked past him into the corridor. Her jacket lining still held the faded unit patch, sewn inside where nobody could see it. Her hands were already clean. Her face was already neutral. The nurse was back. But something had shifted. Something fundamental. The 12 doctors who'd been frozen in that imaging suite had just watched a civilian nurse perform a technique that shouldn't be possible outside a trauma surgery fellowship. They'd heard her voice change. They'd seen her hands move like a surgeon, like a soldier, like someone who'd learned her trade under circumstances that military records were very careful not to describe. Pierce had seen it too. And he was already making calls. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It was going to bring the hospital to its knees. Dr. Pierce didn't wait for the elevator doors to close before making the first call. He stood in the stairwell at Cedar Creek Medical, phone pressed to his ear, his voice smooth as surgical silk. "Richard, it's David Pierce. I need a favor." Richard Bancroft, hospital board chair and Pierce's regular golf partner, listened without interrupting as Pierce laid out the narrative, the rogue nurse performing unauthorized procedures, falsified credentials, patient safety at risk. Within 48 hours, Pierce promised. "I'm having Morris pull her file now." The phone call lasted 6 minutes. By the time Pierce reached his office on the 4th floor, Bancroft had already contacted Patricia Chen, the hospital administrator, to convene an emergency review. Pierce's network moved like a precision instrument. He called 3 more board members, all men he'd cultivated over scotch and golf, all indebted to him for research funding referrals or favorable committee assignments. Each call followed the same architecture: urgent, credible, vague enough to raise questions but specific enough to demand action. "Her references don't check out," he told them. "She's performing procedures outside her scope. We need documentation, obviously, but the liability exposure is significant." By the time he hung up the 4th call, the machinery was in motion. The compliance investigator, Morris, arrived at Cedar Creek by 10 o'clock. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of someone accustomed to finding what people wanted him to find. Pierce handed him Laura's personnel file with the casual confidence of a man holding a winning hand. "Start here," Pierce said. "Something's off. I can feel it." Morris spread the file across his desk like a surgeon preparing an autopsy. What he found was bureaucratic gold, transcripts from her nursing degree program that were incomplete, references that dated back 6 years with vague job titles and no contact information, an application that raised more questions than it answered. Her work history showed gaps, entire years unaccounted for, a resume that suggested she'd dropped off the grid multiple times. Most damning, when Morris began making calls to verify her references at Mercy General in Seattle and St. Jude's in Chicago, the phone numbers were disconnected, the names no longer employed there. One administrator in Denver didn't remember her at all. "It's like she doesn't exist," Morris said, looking up from his notes. "Or like she's hiding something." Pierce smiled. The expression didn't reach his eyes. Or both. By noon, Pierce and Morris walked into Patricia Chen's office with the file spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene. Missing transcripts. Unverifiable employment history. References that led nowhere. And underneath it all, the photographic documentation, Laura performing a procedure on Tyler Graves that no RN credential on file would authorize. Pierce presented the narrative with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Patient safety, he kept repeating. Liability. Unauthorized medical intervention. He left out the part where the patient's vitals had stabilized. He left out the part where the boy was still breathing. Chen listened, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. "How is this possible? How did she pass the background check?" "That's the question," Pierce said. "Which is why we need to act decisively. Now." By 2 o'clock, the termination decision was made. By 3, Pierce had documented it, had Morris prepare the file, had security alerted. Laura Bennett would arrive for her shift the next morning to find herself erased from the system. Her badge would deactivate at midnight. Security would be waiting. Laura arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 6:43 in the morning on a Tuesday that felt exactly like every other morning, which meant it felt like nothing at all. She'd been trained not to feel mornings. Mornings were information gathering. Mornings were mission parameters. She approached the badge reader and swiped. The light blinked red. The security guard, a man named Todd who usually just nodded at her, stepped forward with an expression of practiced sympathy. "Nurse Bennett? We need you to come with us." Morris was waiting in the lobby with the HR director, a woman named Susan whose hands trembled slightly as she held the termination letter. "Due to discrepancies in your employment file and unauthorized medical procedures conducted outside your scope of practice, your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated effective immediately," Morris read, his voice pitched loud enough that families in the waiting area turned to stare. A child dropped a toy. Someone's phone stopped ringing. The lobby went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze from an open patient room 3 floors up. "You have 15 minutes to collect personal belongings under escort," Morris continued. "After that, you're to leave the premises." Laura didn't argue. Arguing was for people who still believed in the system. She walked to the break room flanked by 2 security guards whose radios crackled against their hips like nervous heartbeats. The locker door opened with the familiar metallic hiss of hinges that needed oil. She packed methodically. A cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a gift from Tyler 3 weeks ago, made in art therapy. A wilting succulent she'd been trying to keep alive for 3 months, an exercise in patience that had finally failed. A photograph in a cardboard frame, 8 soldiers in combat gear, standing in front of a Chinook helicopter somewhere in Helmand Province. All of them dead now. All of them buried in a mission that officially never happened. She held the photo for exactly 4 seconds, then placed it in the box. One of the security guards, the taller one, watched her face. He expected tears, probably. He expected some kind of reaction. He got none. Laura's hands remained steady. Her jaw didn't clench. She sealed the box with an efficiency that suggested she'd packed up her life before, which she had, many times, in many countries, under circumstances that would have broken most people into fragments. They walked her through the lobby at 6:58 in the morning. Dr. Pierce stood at the window of his 4th-floor office, watching her exit. His arms were crossed. His expression was the serene satisfaction of a man who'd orchestrated something perfectly. The glass doors opened. Rain hammered the parking lot outside, a sound like distant applause, or like the world laughing at something only it understood. Laura stood at the bus stop for 17 minutes before anyone else arrived. The cardboard box was growing soft around the edges, the rain bleeding through. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't call anyone. She simply stood there, balanced on the edge of the curb, and stared at the photograph of her unit through the wet cardboard. 8 faces. 8 ghost lives. Her hands had held their wounds together in field hospitals that shouldn't exist, on classified missions in countries that officially had nothing to do with America. She'd performed thoracotomies with combat knives, with whatever metal she could sterilize, with the kind of precision that came from understanding that pain was data and that death was simply a problem that needed solving. But that version of her, Captain Laura Bennett, the one with a clearance above top secret, the one whose records had been erased from every official database after Operation Silent Shepherd went sideways, that version of her was supposed to stay dead. That was the arrangement. That was the price of the extraction, the price of the new identity, the price of becoming invisible enough that the Pentagon could deny her existence at diplomatic hearings. She'd accepted it. She'd lived it for 6 years, taking jobs that civilians took, wearing scrubs instead of armor, healing people who would never know she'd already carried blood-soaked soldiers across kill zones. The bus pulled up at 6:58. She stepped inside and the doors hissed closed behind her like the world exhaling. That evening, standing at a different bus stop in the rain, the cardboard box still balanced on her hip, the faded unit patch inside her jacket lining soaked through but still stitched in place, Laura wondered if disappearing completely might be easier than this half-life. At least as Captain Bennett, she'd had a mission. At least as a ghost, she'd had purpose. As neither, as nothing, as a woman standing in the rain with a cracked mug and a dead succulent and a photograph of 8 people the government had murdered and erased, what exactly was she supposed to do with the rest of her life? The rain fell harder. She didn't care. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was about to find out that her son had been saving one thing she'd asked him never to save, hiding one box she'd explicitly told him to destroy, and that he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment when she had nothing left to lose. The hospital lobby doors burst open like a gunshot. Marcus Bennett, 16 years old, rain-soaked and breathless, stood silhouetted against the grey Denver afternoon. In his hands, he held a shadow box. The kind museums used for artifacts. The kind families used for things they couldn't bear to display. Mom. His voice carried across the atrium, bouncing off marble and chrome. They need to see these. Laura was standing 3 floors above, in the physical therapy wing, her hand steadying Tyler Graves as the boy gripped parallel bars. The boy's legs had begun responding to stimulus 3 days after the emergency decompression. No one had expected that. 12 specialists had written it off as false hope. But false hope is just hope that hasn't proven itself yet. She felt the moment freeze. The entire floor seemed to inhale at once. Marcus held the shadow box higher, his shoulders heaving from running. From the entrance security desk, a guard reached for his radio, but something in the boy's urgency made him hesitate. Parents don't burst through hospital doors like that unless the news is either devastating or essential. This felt essential. Laura's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. Just enough. She positioned Tyler's grip on the bars, left hand first, then right, and stepped back. Hold position. Breathe. Then she moved. Her stride was different now. Not the cautious shuffle of a nurse deferring to authority. This was the movement of someone who'd calculated distance and purpose and decided both mattered equally. Her badge clattered against her ribs like a heartbeat, the sound crystallizing through the hallway like breaking glass. Major Graves was in the observation room, watching his son's progress through reinforced glass. He turned at the noise. His eyes found her face first. Then followed her line of sight downward, to the lobby 3 stories below where Marcus stood holding a shadow box like a torch. The Major went white. Laura saw it happen. The color draining from a man's face like water from a sink. His hand moved unconsciously to his forearm, where a tattoo was visible beneath his short-sleeved shirt. A single word in military font. A call sign. A ghost. Valkyrie, he whispered. He said it like a prayer. Like a name he'd been waiting 18 months to speak aloud. The lobby was filling now. Hospital staff emerging from corridors and break rooms, drawn by the disruption. Marcus was still holding the shadow box. Still waiting. His mother was descending the stairs now, moving like something inevitable, like weather you couldn't negotiate with. A Marine colonel was in the lobby, visiting hours, courtesy tour of the facility his nephew was being treated in. He was still in dress blues, the kind of uniform that made every space feel smaller. He watched Marcus, then watched the crowd assembling, then noticed Laura emerging from the stairwell. Something in the moment pivoted. The colonel stepped forward. His movements were precise, economical. A man trained to make every gesture count. He took the shadow box from Marcus's hands with the reverence of someone handling classified material. Inside, medals. 4 of them. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And beneath them, a Navy Cross. The colonel's breath caught audibly. He held the box at chest height, turning slightly so the light caught the metal, and read aloud from the citation affixed to the backing, Captain Laura Bennett, for extraordinary heroism under fire during Operation Silent Shepherd, where she performed field surgery on 17 casualties while extracting a downed reconnaissance team from. That's a forgery. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the lobby like a scalpel. He was emerging from his office on the second floor, red-faced, his tie already loosened as if he'd been pulling at his collar in panic. "That is a fabricated military record. I have documentation. I can prove." The glass doors of Cedar Creek Medical opened again. A 3-star general walked through them like he'd been called by the building itself. Not metaphorically. Marcus's calls had reached a Pentagon operator on his mother's confiscated address book, a number marked only with the letters VK, Valkyrie's key, a direct line she'd been ordered never to use and never to explain. That number had been routed. Cross-referenced. Verified. And within 90 minutes of Marcus's first call, a call had been placed to Fort Carson. Then to Peterson Space Command. Then to the Pentagon. The general didn't remove his cap. Didn't extend his hand for a handshake. He walked directly to the shadow box, looked at the medals for exactly 3 seconds, and then saluted. Not Laura. Her decorations. His voice was like steel being poured. Captain Laura Bennett's records were classified above top secret under military directive for .2.7J, clandestine personnel protection. Her cover as a civilian has been maintained since 2019 for national security purposes. The documentation you're referencing, Dr. Pierce, is entirely fabricated and constitutes federal fraud. Silence. The kind that fills space like water. Pierce's face had moved beyond red now. It was approaching purple, the color of someone whose entire world was condensing. I can explain. The forms are legitimate. The background checks. You forged them, a woman's voice said from the second-floor landing. An FBI agent, badge visible, stepping out of the shadows where she'd been standing for the last 12 minutes. I've been investigating your research grant fraud for 4 months, Dr. Pierce. The $340,000 you diverted from the neurology study. The ghost-written papers you claimed authorship on. But evidence tampering? Attempting to create false documentation to obstruct a military investigation? That's federal. The agent descended the stairs slowly. Like a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. My agent secured your office computers at 2:38 this morning. Your hard drive contains 847 emails detailing your attempts to discredit Captain Bennett. Your search history shows 17 separate attempts to access military records databases you had no authorization to view. And in your desk drawer, we found 3 draft documents with military seals fabricated in Microsoft Word. The file creation dates are time-stamped. Pierce's attorney materialized from somewhere. Or maybe he'd been there all along and the moment had just finally become real enough to need him. Stop, the lawyer said, placing a hand on Pierce's shoulder. Don't say another word. But Pierce was already talking. Words spilling like blood from a wound. She was dangerous. Nobody knew who she was. She violated every protocol. She performed unauthorized. She saved a child's life, the general said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they occupied every inch of the lobby. A child 12 specialists had written off. She did it with knowledge earned in active combat zones. Knowledge she earned through service this country asked her to keep secret. Major Graves had come down from the observation room. He crossed to the general and saluted. A soldier greeting a superior officer. Then he turned to his son's monitor on the lobby screen, the boy still holding position on those parallel bars, those impossible bars that shouldn't have held weight but did. 3 days ago, the major said, his voice unsteady, my son was paralyzed. 12 doctors confirmed it. 1 nurse remembered how to save him. And all of us, he looked at the general, at the FBI agent, at Marcus, at his son on the monitor, at the shadow box containing proof of a life that no one was supposed to know about. We knew exactly nothing about who we were standing next to. Laura hadn't moved. She stood in the center of the lobby wearing scrubs that no longer fit her story, her hands at her sides, her composure like reinforced steel. The transformation had been complete by the time she'd reached the ground floor. Captain Laura Bennett, Special Forces, was no longer performing the role of a nurse. She was simply there. Present. Answerable. Pierce was being read his rights. The words came fast and clinical: research grant fraud, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, attempted fraud against the United States military. His hands were being bound. His face was being photographed. His career was becoming a perp walk. And as his dignity contracted to the size of a parking lot, Laura felt the familiar weight of something she'd been carrying for 18 months finally shift. "I'm going on break," she said to no one in particular. Marcus laughed. One sharp bark of laughter that cracked something open in the lobby. Major Graves' hand found her shoulder. Not a grasp. A confirmation. Outside, through the glass doors, rain hammered the parking lot like applause from a storm that had been waiting all along to recognize her. 6 months later, Laura would stand in Cedar Creek Medical's new rehabilitation wing, watching Tyler Graves take his first supported steps. Pierce would be 6 weeks into an 18-month federal sentence, assigned to a facility in Wyoming, his medical license revoked, his reputation a cautionary tale. The supply van job would be his only option upon release, driving equipment from a rural clinic, returning to the bottom of hierarchies he'd spent his career dismantling others to escape. But that was future. Right now, in this lobby in Denver, with medals visible and a general present and an FBI agent securing evidence, Laura's hidden service was vindicated. The 12 doctors who'd given up. The one nurse who hadn't. The system that had tried to erase her. All of it was finally visible. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. But sometimes, the world catches you anyway. And when it does, all you can do is stand there in your scrubs and let them finally see. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever kept a secret that could change everything, if you've ever wondered what you'd do when everything you've hidden finally becomes undeniable, subscribe to see more stories of hidden strength. Comment below. Would you have saved him, or walked away? And like this video so more people discover the heroes wearing scrubs instead of uniforms.